When you hear the term standard, what comes to your mind? Quality comes to your mind, right? When you hear the term standard after some word, it pretty much says there is a measure of quality, that they do something to measure or maintain the quality. So that's what coding standards are all about. Now, coding standards, if you think of it, has so many benefits. Like sometimes you would hear these terms for it: coding rules, guidelines, and most of the times best practices. Now the best thing about coding standards is, even though the syntax is all the same, it implies that this is how you need to write your code. Let's look at one of our old codes. Now there is a way you need to write code. Now, when it comes to HTML, the syntax has to be it has to be lowercase. You need to use proper IDs instead of ID selectors. You have to use class selectors. Now, what this ensures is, this ensures performance. Coding standards also ensures performance, that instead of doing the different way, you could do the chosen way. I mean, which is actually chosen for performance. So you could do that. So performance really relies on the basic level on the coding standards. And in terms of safety, there are some standards being mentioned that this is how safety has to be followed. There has to be document type mentioned in the top in the HTML. Sometimes, if you see, typical programming languages will have some safety measures, all that has to be maintained. And then reliability. Now, when you say reliability, we make sure that this code that we wrote, it will obviously execute. So those kind of standards will also be maintained. And the code has to be testable and maintainable. Now, if you look at this is a typical HTML example, but whatever I'm saying now, it applies to any programming language. Obviously, HTML is not a programming language here. Now, just look at it. This div is inside this div, and this div is inside this div. Now, when you think about it, the the parent-child relationship or the hierarchy could be easily seen when it is indented. This child is indented. When this child is indented. Now, we also main coding standards to have a uniformity so that other developers also look at our code. Now, you might think as a programmer, you will just code, but you will also spend most of your time reading someone else's code, because a project is done by so many people in the team. So those programmers will also see your code and you will also see their code. So if you have a uniformity, it will make a lot of sense and to easily understand. So this is not a story or a poetry that it's that's so easy to understand with your natural language. But this is code, right? So code, to understand it better, it has to be formatted well. Now, if you see, there is two indentation here, but there's a four indentation here, which is quite wrong. If the uniformity is right, if the parent for the parent-child relationship, if the indentation is equal everywhere that you see, then obviously your brain will look for patterns, and that's how your brain will try to understand quicker, instead of instead of just going deep and looking into each and every line. When you just look at it, your brain would try to understand with the kind of indentation and the hierarchy that used. It will easily perceive what is being trying to say here. So, you could also comment it out. You could also use a lot of comments. Now, now, using comments, I would preferably, I would say that it is a very bad habit, because if you use comment, you would have to explain it for every other piece of code. But instead of commenting, try to use proper naming conventions. Now, let's say if you are adding two numbers and you give the button values like add two numbers, obviously anyone who reading that would understand that. So you don't need comment to explicitly say what it is trying to do. But there are some places where it is very complicated, it gets very complicated, and there's no way that you could explain someone how it is done. So there you would write comments, so that's all right. Now there's this thing about what it does and how you do it. Now what it does is what you generally think about commenting, but what it does is something that should come within the naming convention itself. If how you do it, if it becomes very complex, and then probably you could think about commenting. Now coding standard, if you just think about it, it is just not aligning the text. Coding standard means a lot. If I mean coding standard, all or best practices mean instead of id use class for better performance. So that leads to performance, right? So when you say coding standards, it says that there is a quality being maintained. So that is why we say, or we call it coding standard. Now using the right amount of using the right text or the right keyword also makes sure that your code will be portable too. So working in one environment, it should also work in another environment. So all that has to be taken care of. So in short, coding standard or best practices or coding rules or guidelines, these all leads to safety, performance, security, reliability. It's maintainable and it's portable. Now, it's just not about how it looks, it is also about how your runtime environment will perceive this. So it's two things. It's how the programmer who codes it or someone who reads it will look at it. That's one thing. The second thing is how the browser or the runtime environment. In case of HTML, CSS, browser is a runtime environment. So how the runtime environment will look at this code and execute it. So browser, if it looks at a different entity instead of say there are two ways to code. So there are two keywords that you could use. One keyword does less performance and the other keyword does better performance. You would obviously go for the keyword that performs better. So like that, a runtime environment, to make the runtime environment perform better, execute this code faster, you will also use that. So take in perspective of two entities. One is the programmer itself and the second is the runtime environment.